What blame does the West share for the continuation of the war in Ukraine? According to Vladimir Putin, we should bear most of it. He says it was the expansion of NATO that provoked Russia into a war of self-defense. On the other side, the UK, the US, and Ukrainian governments say Putin's account turns reality on its head. They say Russia is fighting an imperialist war against its neighbour, and the West has simply helped Ukraine defend itself. Now, personally, I think it's pretty indisputable that Russia is fighting an imperialist war, but whether the West are acting in the interest of a sustainable peace is much more questionable. And a key area under dispute is whether the West blocked the possibility of a ceasefire in March last year. That's been heavily contested ever since, but the mediator in those talks has now spoken publicly about what exactly occurred in those crucial meetings between Ukraine and Russia. He's the former Prime Minister of Israel, Neftali Bennett.
נגיד את זה בצורה רחבה, אני חושב שהייתה החלטה של המערב לגיטימית, שכרגע צריך להמשיך להכות בפוטין ולא להגיע.
אבל מה זה להכות בפוטין? פוטין ניקה באוקראינה, לא?
שנייה, לא, בסדר, אבל שאל מול, זאת אומרת, הגישה היותר תקיפה,
כן.
אני אגיד לך משהו, אני לא יודע להגיד שהם שגו.
כי אתה אומר, אולי בריונים אחרים בעולם היו רואים...
העמדה שלי באותו הזמן, בעניין הזה זה לא אינטרס לאומי ישראלי.
כן.
בשונה מקונסוליה או איראן, שאני דואג לישראל, עומד חזק פה,
כן.
אין לי סי, אני בסך הכל מוציא לפועל ומתווך, אבל הכתובת שלי זה אמריקה בעניין הזה, ואני לא פועל על דעת עצמי. כל פעולה שעשיתי הייתה מתואמת לפרטי פרטים, גם עם ארצות הברית, גם עם גרמניה, גם עם צרפת.
אז הם בעצם חדלו את זה?
בגדול, כן, בגדול הם חדלו את זה, ובאותו זמן חשבתי שהם שוגים. בדיעבד, מוקדם לדעת.
So that interview was released on Neftali Bennett's own YouTube channel. And the deal Bennett was talking about there would have involved Putin giving up on toppling Zelensky and allowing Ukraine to arm itself. So that's denazification in their words, of course, and demilitarization. Bennett is saying he would have given up those. Ukraine, in turn, would have renounced its ambition to join NATO. Now, Bennett said both Putin and Zelensky were willing to come to such a deal, but the West decided on a more aggressive stance and blocked it. As for divisions within the West, Bennett said that, quote, Boris Johnson adopted the aggressive line, Macron and Scholz, that's the French and German leaders, were more pragmatic, and Biden was both. To discuss the significance of the claims made in that interview, I spoke to Branko Marcetic, who writes on US foreign policy and the Ukraine war for Jacobin magazine.
This suggests, and as one more data point that adds to the fact that there is a significant number of nations in the NATO alliance who view the Ukraine war as something of an opportunity to try to weaken Russia as part of a larger geopolitical strategy. And so for their purposes, ending the war earlier and with less bloodshed on each side was inconvenient. It meant that Russia would not have suffered the kind of catastrophic casualty numbers and the destruction of equipment and so on and so forth that it suffered over the course of this war.
There's two questions. Did the West advise against a peace deal, and then what were their motives in doing so? And I suppose you've put forward there the cynical motives. They want to bleed Russia dry, so they're actually quite keen on a war continuing. I suppose the less cynical version would be they're saying, look, there's no point in signing any kind of ceasefire deal with Vladimir Putin because all he'll be using this to do is to buy some time so he can build up his troops and ultimately get what he wants, which is sort of the imperial overthrow of any kind of autonomous Ukraine. I mean, what do you make of that argument?
There's a bunch of things that you could say are motivating it. I mean, Bennett himself says that one motivation also is the idea of sending a message to other aggressor states that, if they launch invasion, well, it's going to cost them. So, I'm going to say it's the only thing that's going on here. But again, I mean, the more cynical explanation is not something that I'm inventing here or kind of just speculating. I mean, again, there have been reports explicitly kind of saying this. And, you might think back to for instance, Secretary of Defense Lloyd Austin saying way back early last year, saying that, the plan here was to weaken Russia, so it can't do this kind of thing again. Or you might think also to the Ukrainian Pravda report last year, where Boris Johnson flew to Kiev with no previous announcement. Suddenly appeared there, saying that look, we're not going to recognize any sort of result in negotiations that Zelensky and Putin come to. Instead, what we're going to do is we think Putin's shown that he's weak and we should press him. So there's various reporting that's been out there that suggests that the more cynical read is part of what is going on. It's not the only motivation. I think you're right. What you've mentioned is probably also in the mix. I think what Bennett was saying, this idea of kind of trying to signal to other invading states what might happen to them, I think is also part of it. But I think, unfortunately, there is a little bit of cynical geopolitical maneuvering going on here, I'm afraid.
I came across this interview via Twitter. And when I was looking for it in sort of mainstream reporting, there were lots of people who had written up Neftali Bennett saying that Putin had said he wouldn't kill Zelensky. That seems to be the bit that the Western media is covering. But no one seems to be mentioning at all this idea that, a deal was about to be reached, but then the West scuttled it. Now, they might not accept that. They might say that there are two sides to this argument, but they seem to be completely ignoring it. What do you make of that?
Well, I think it's a very inconvenient fact. I mean, I think for one, it doesn't. We've been sold this war as, basically a war of good versus evil, where you have NATO on the side of good and Russia on the side of evil. And I think this kind of points to the much more complicated reality, which is that it's not quite that black and white. Our side, the good guys, sometimes do things that are not good, so that are very deleterious to both the interests of working people in those countries and to Ukrainians themselves. You think about, say, the invocation of Ukrainian agency throughout this war, which has often been used, and I would say almost exclusively been used, to only make arguments that are in furtherance of the war. You never hear agency being invoked when early in the war, and as late as I would say, May and June last year, Zelensky was constantly talking about how the war was going to end in peace talks, how negotiations had to happen, how he wanted the West to be more involved in negotiations. Even when Bucha was discovered, he said, this is going to make it more difficult, but ultimately talks are going to be the way it ends. All of that, this interview kind of busts every one of those things, and it shows that I think, again, agency is being invoked very cynically, but more importantly, I think people aren't being informed about what exactly at different points in this conflict Ukrainian leadership has wanted and what actually Ukrainian agency has meant.
The discussion we're having now, a response from many people watching might be, look, I know you've said that sort of Ukrainian agency is invoked in an opportunistic way, but it's also pretty clear that, the majority of support in Ukraine does want to continue fighting this war, or at least doesn't want to make serious concessions to Russia. One of the reasons is because of the huge human rights violations that have been committed in that country. Obviously, one of the reasons talks were scuppered was because of the revelations from Bucha of war crimes. So how would you respond to that?
Well, I mean, Bucha was definitely a factor. And that's another one of these points that I think makes what Bennett's saying a lot more believable, because, in fact, that was one of the points in the Pravda report in last year, that it wasn't just the appearance of Johnson, it was also the discovery of Bucha that made selling a peace deal with Russia domestically for Zelensky much more difficult. But I think what that points to is, do we know that a possible peace deal would have held, given the discovery of that atrocity? No, we don't. But it does suggest that for it to have happened, Zelensky needed the political support of his Western partners, and they were not willing to give it to him. And we'll unfortunately never know whether this war could have been ended, weeks into the conflict. But it to me, it seems like a real lost opportunity that it wasn't tried. And the fact that, that Johnson didn't make the trip, that Bennett says that, ultimately Ukraine's Western partners did basically veto this deal, I think it shows that they, the countries that wanted the war to continue, they did think that it could could have conceivably come to an end there. And it wasn't a risk they were willing to take. So, I think it's a real tragedy. It's a tragedy for the world. It's a tragedy for Ukraine, most of all.
No one in Britain has missed Liz Truss, but as someone who cares little for public opinion, that hasn't stopped Britain's shortest-serving Prime Minister mounting an attempted comeback. She's penned a 4,000-word article for the Sunday Telegraph with this headline: